I just returned from America, having toured there, and just to fill the film on the camera, I took a random photo with no care at all. It managed to create this very emotional image that showed the seclusion of an artist making away from the noise of the rest of the world. I think I had burnout from making too much music year after year after year, and I just all at once felt absolutely no connection to music at all. For the majority of my life, music has always been a safety to kind of venture into, so it was very scary to all of a sudden feel like there was nothing there. Even to the point where I was thinking, I need to think about new things to do with my life now because it felt completely empty. I just forced myself not to expect anything and just to slowly meander through making. It was probably a year of feeling like this, but time can change in dimension, so it felt like 10 years in a way. But yeah, I just eventually drifted towards things very, very slowly, and there was a few sparks on the way that kind of ignited a kind of sensation that I would have felt 10, 15 years ago when making music. I made a lot of work being away from the studio with materials that I'd recorded and then collaging and moving them around. The environment affects your choices, and there's a cleanliness to just looking at a screen away from other equipment. And a lot of the time I'm just listening. I might spend 200 hours listening to something, listening to different versions, which sounds crazy, but it's just, I find that I think a lot about the behavior of music, and it's just, yeah, never-ending kind of research. My studio is still very kind of DIY. I've always liked studios that resemble the kind of things when you first got into producing, and I think I'll always want things to be like that. I think working away from my studio is complementary to working with one device at a time. For example, I often just use the Rev 2 going into a pedal and concentrate on capturing lots of material from that in an improvised way. I'm often using several layers that I think have something interesting about them, and then later moving them around and seeing how they affect other things. Everything's quite playful and simple. I like to be quick and moving things around, like making brush marks on a canvas. One thing I like to do quite frequently with a synth like this is to drone out a chord. And what that means is if I'm playing 8 notes, they will exist forever. And so if you want to move to a new chord or a single note all of a sudden, you have to simply override those notes by playing very rapidly the new note that you want to play. And that becomes useful in terms of music because you have to do things in order to get there, and it changes the shape of music. I'll often sort of dip the volume, maybe wash it out a little bit, override the note and then bring it back into the mix, and you get this kind of miniature composition that comes from having to do that. Placing a synthesizer in a very real acoustic reverb space, like using convolution, it sounds wrong to me somehow. So I tend to use quite crude plate reverbs, spring reverbs, and sometimes 100% wet, where you really hear a very metallic coloring of the sound. There's a lot of exploration of acoustic sounds on the record. I often recorded cymbals placed on fabric so that they're completely deadened. They have a strange metallic knock to them. And there's a lot of guitar playing on the record, mainly because it's instant and you kind of understand the notes, which sounds a bit ridiculous, but I find that with electronic instruments, you can be focused too much on the sound rather than the notes and the kind of functionality of the actual notes. So there's a lot of guitar playing on the record as a way for me to place notes and to contrast the kind of more sound design synthesis that's going on. Often I recorded the guitar just with the laptop microphone, and there's this very nice contrast between a very, controlled, synthesized world, and then this is very crude laptop microphone guitar. The thing itself can actually be not that desirable, but in combination with other things becomes very interesting to me. So I like to play around with different feelings and sensations with sound, and that includes the acoustic. There's definitely a lot of processing as well, layers and layers of effects, often very simple, but layers of effects. One thing I love to do is to stack multiple instances of autopan to create lots of different rhythmic articulations. Each one is set to a different kind of division of time. I often use, I guess you would say, techno kind of rhythmic articulations. 16th notes, dotted rhythms. But one interesting thing I find is if you have things that are very on grid and have one that is completely free, you can play with the free one, and the way that it interacts with the other instances creates polyrhythms at times. I simply map the amount generally and the free frequency to pots on the launch control XL, and it just gives me a very playful, quick way of just adding rhythmic articulation to a chord. It's amazing to do actually, because if other music's playing and you can just bring in a sensation of rhythm that's completely different to what else is going on, you can play with the tension between the grid and the non-grid. That's very interesting to use live, because you can just create a lot of momentum with a simple droned chord. If you're only making music in a studio, I find that the art suffers very quickly, because you need to allow yourself to be vulnerable and to be undermined in different spaces. I could make something in a studio and feel like it has a lot of integrity, and then I could take it to a different space and it could evaporate. Luckily, I had the privilege to travel around the world and play shows, but I find that just showing work to different people already changes your perspective, because they, even without speaking, psychologically affect how you perceive your own ideas. Probably because I'm very influenced by cinema since a young age, I often think of my music being very visual. A lot of the video content is stuff that I've made over the years, and also things that Sky, the visual artist, has made. We use sensitive visual implications to things that make you perceive new things in the music. It's very much like collaging things together in the same way that I collage sound together. but a lot of improvisation with both, really, instead of here's just playback. I only have two hands, so there's a limit to obviously how wild improvisation can get, but I just like to move around a lot of my work. There's a lot of identifiable parts in the music that are heard and also kind of not heard that maybe I discarded but also become newly relevant at a gig. Density resolve into less things happening. Chords which are very chaotic and have tension in them resolve into the kind of glory of major chords. There's so many ways that you can explore these values, and I'm doing it all the time within a song. It's just kind of fundamental music language, but it's just easy to overlook it because you're distracted by 1,000 parameters. I think for a long time I was really crude about music in a kind of way that's almost shameful. There was a tension between me and other artists on the label. They, to me, were doing things that felt very elegant and mature, and I felt like I was doing the opposite for a long time. But there's something very contrived about trying to do something precisely the moment you start doing something. It doesn't really make any sense. I really don't know what great advice I could give to anyone, but as much as possible, be sensitive to what you're doing and listen carefully. It needs time to understand things. I've got to a point over a long time, like 10, 15 years, where getting used to technology, experiencing more things, being calmer and being more sensitive, coming together mean that I have a better attitude towards making. And so it's just trying to be aware when you're making music of all these qualities. It's kind of never ending, really. But it's kind of the beauty of making, I think.